His private jet had everything except permission to land. But when it crashed in the middle of a dying Kansas farm, the millionaire pilot wasn't met with lawsuits or fences. Instead, the farmer offered him water, no questions, no judgment, just a man in boots, staring at a stranger in a suit and asking if he was hurt. That silence. It carried something deeper than paperwork, and behind it, a secret no one was ready to face. If you've ever believed that where you fall might just be where you rise, stay with us. And if the story moves you, like share or leave a thought, it keeps the light on. A thunderstorm had settled over Salina, Kansas, casting a heavy, bruised shadow across the flat land. At the northern edge of Dawson family farms, Luke Dawson fought the stubborn latch on the cattle barn, hands numb from rain and worry. The farm had always felt small, especially tonight, surrounded by fields of sunflowers, bowing under the weight of the storm, for years. Luke had lived with a quiet sense of defeat, haunted by debts and seasons that never yielded enough. He'd learned to expect little and to fix what broke with his own two hands. Suddenly, a foreign noise tore the sky open, a jet engine shrieking above the thunder's drum. Luke looked up in time to see a private plane plummet, the nose shearing through clouds, engines coughing flame. For a long heartbeat, disbelief held him still. Then the ground shook. A fireball exploded above the sunflowers, spraying shards of metal and a pulse of heat so sharp it cut through the rain. Without thinking, Luke ran. Boots sank into the muddy field as lightning carved blue veins across the horizon. The downpour was merciless, blurring the world to water and fire. As he approached the wreck, heat rippled against his soaked shirt. One wing had snapped, flames crawling along the fuselage. Instinct shouted at him to stay back, but something deeper drove him forward. He climbed onto a twisted strut and yanked the cockpit door until it gave way. Smoke stung his eyes. Inside, a woman slumped over the control's blonde hair matted with blood, her jaw slack, her body limp. She wore a flight suit, expensive and foreign in this stretch of Kansas. Luke fumbled with her harness, hands shaking as the heat closed in. Her eyes fluttered, not quite conscious. He pulled her free, half carrying, half dragging her away from the burning shell. His chest heaved with effort and fear. He'd never felt so alone. The storm raged. The world shrunk to a single desperate task. Reaching the edge of the sunflower field, Luke laid her on the wet grass. Blood was pouring from a deep gash in her calf, a jagged piece of metal still lodged in the muscle. Luke stripped off his flannel shirt, pressing it against the wound. The woman groaned, lips pale and trembling. Luke's hands, calloused from years of labor, looked clumsy against her skin. "Stay with me," he murmured, voice low, fighting to keep her present. There was no answer but her ragged breath. Above them, the sky kept rumbling. The world shrank to this patch of mud and pain. Luke fumbled for his cell, but it was dead, rain-soaked and useless, distantly. He heard sirens, maybe real, maybe just wishful thinking. He shouted once, but the wind carried his voice away. He could see the life bleeding out of her, yet he kept pressure on the wound, refusing to let go. Memories flashed his father's rough hands, his mother's gentle scold, the years spent holding on when it would have been easier to quit. That old shame crept up again. The farm was never enough, and now he feared it might not even be enough to save this woman. Still, he pushed that thought aside. All he could do was act. A new danger hissed through the rain, gasoline pooling around the wreck, catching the first hungry licks of fire. Luke's heart hammered. The flames leaped higher, emboldened by the wind. If the fire reached the fuel tank, the explosion would finish what the crash had started. With no time left, Luke hoisted the woman, cradling her as best he could, and staggered back toward the barn. He barely made it to cover before the world behind him erupted in a wall of heat and noise. He shielded her with his own body, the concussion rolling through his bones. When the echo faded, there was only the rain, the stink of smoke, and the feel of her pulse weak but stubborn against his wrist. He didn't know her name or what twist of fate had dropped her here. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her, not now. The The storm kept pounding the fields, but somewhere beneath the noise, something quiet began to change. The storm kept pounding against the windows, rattling every loose board in Luke Dawson's weathered farmhouse. He carried the injured woman inside, her weight a shock to his arms, the hem of her flight suit trailing mud across the threshold. Luke laid her gently on the old corduroy sofa, sweat and rainwater running together down his neck. The room was lit by a single bare bulb, flickering with every gust of wind. Beyond the walls, the farm was swallowed by darkness, the fields lost beneath the relentless rain. He grabbed a bottle of cheap whiskey from the kitchen shelf, pouring it over a rag and cleaning the wound on her calf. The smell filled the air, sharp and raw. She groaned, half awake for a moment, eyes fluttering before her head lolled to the side. Luke bit his lip, wrapping the cut with a strip torn from an old t-shirt. Her skin was clammy. Blood still seeped through, but the flow slowed under the pressure of his hands. He sat back for a second, wiping his brow with a shaky hand. The radio on the counter sputtered, the local station warning of flash floods in Kansas City, static crackling between every word. Luke glanced around. He felt the old weight of isolation, just him and this stranger, with the rest of the world washed away. He spotted her bag on the floor, half burned, leather scorched and torn. He rifled through it, hoping for anything that might tell him who she was. There was a wallet, the contents soaked and streaked with soot. He found a driver's license, Ava Sinclair, the name barely legible, the photo faded. There was no phone, no address book, only a hotel receipt from Wichita and a plane ticket stub. Whoever she was, she hadn't planned on ending up here. Luke plugged his own phone into the wall, but it was useless, dead from the rain, the battery refusing to take a charge. He cursed under his breath, glancing over at Ava. She looked small and out of place, even as unconscious as she was. He tried to shake the feeling of powerlessness, the sense that he'd been left behind by the world, by luck, by the simple march of time. He thought of the years the bank had threatened to take the land, the nights he'd spent wondering what would come next, but something in him refused to quit. He tucked a pillow under her head, listening to the storm. Responsibility old, stubborn, bone deep, pushed him to keep moving. He checked the radios for a rescue signal, fiddling with the dials, but the frequencies only offered garbled static. He called the emergency number from his landline. After a long wait, a dispatcher explained that the roads were impassable, the ambulance delayed by at least an hour, maybe more. Luke's chest tightened. He hung up, not letting the fear show on his face. He sat at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the storm and the soft rasp of Ava's breathing. He watched her sleep, his mind drifting to empty rooms and old memories. It wasn't pity he felt, more like a hard knot of resolve. He couldn't help thinking about the last time a stranger came through Selena, how the town had looked at him wary, suspicious, unwilling to reach out. He wondered if that same suspicion would turn on him, if anyone found out about the woman in his living room. Luke checked the windows, locking each one. He moved quietly, the habits of a man used to fending for himself. The clock ticked past midnight. The power flickered again. On the table, his flashlight glowed weakly, its batteries nearly gone. He turned it off, relying on the pale lamp. Suddenly, a flash of movement outside the window caught his eye, a shadow, hunched against the wind, passing by the porch. Luke stood, heart pounding, grabbing the baseball bat he kept near the door. He pressed his back to the wall, listening hard. For a long moment, there was nothing but rain and wind. He looked down at Ava, still unconscious, a world of secrets behind her shuttered eyes. Luke peered out into the dark, uncertain if it was a neighbor, a drifter, or someone looking for trouble. The flashlight flickered to life on its own, then died again, casting wild shadows along the walls. Outside, the shadow moved once more, then vanished into the night, leaving Luke cold and wide awake, unsure if he was protecting Ava or both of them from something bigger than the storm. The Kansas sky, cleansed by hours of relentless rain, held a strange hush. The storm had finally spent itself, but the earth was still raw, muddy ruts in the yard, the faint metallic tang of ozone lingering in the air. Morning light cut through the patchwork curtains in the farmhouse kitchen, painting long lines across the battered table. Luke Dawson hadn't slept. He watched over the stranger Ava every hour, checking her breathing, listening for any sign of change. He'd bandaged her wound as best he could. Her face, in sleep, seemed much younger than before, all the tension drained away by exhaustion and pain. A knock echoed across the quiet, startling him from his reverie. Out front, a battered Ford pickup idled by the mailbox. Earl Jefferson, neighbor and sometime landlord, stepped out, boots squelching in the mud. Earl was a big man, his face weathered, jaw unshaven, cap pulled low. He scanned the yard with the wary air of someone who'd spent his life guarding what little he had. The Jefferson place butted up against the back field, and Earl rarely visited unless something was wrong. Luke wiped his hands on his jeans, heart thudding. He hesitated, glancing at Ava, who remained unconscious on the sofa. He gently lifted her and carried her into the grain room, laying her on a pile of burlap sacks. The air in there was heavy with the smell of old corn and dust. He closed the door, his mind racing. Earl stomped up the porch steps. "Heard a ruckus out here last night," he called, peering in as Luke opened the door. "You see anything?" "Luke, sounded like the world coming apart over your way." Luke shrugged, forcing a tired smile. Lightning hit the old weather vane, knocked it clean off the roof. He kept his voice light, hiding the edge in his nerves. Earl leaned against the doorframe, looking past Luke into the shadows of the house. "Funny," he said. "Didn't smell no smoke this morning. Folks up the road say they saw a fireball, maybe a mile out." His eyes were sharp, suspicious. "You all right?" "Anything I can help with?" Luke shook his head. "No, sir. Just patching things up, same as always. Power flickered out a while, but I'll manage." He wished Earl would leave, that the questions would stop, but Earl stayed. He stepped inside, gaze lingering on the mud tracked across the floor, the faded bloodstain on Luke's sleeve. His silence was its own interrogation. Luke felt himself shrinking, reminded of every time the bank manager looked down on him, every whisper that said Dawson Farms was a lost cause. Finally, Earl grunted, clapping Luke on the shoulder. "You holler if you need anything," he said, then shuffled out, boots leaving deep marks in the soft earth. The pickup rumbled off down the gravel road, dust mixing with the last of the rain. Luke exhaled, letting the door fall shut behind him. He hurried to the grain room, heart pounding. Ava was awake, eyes wide and darting, her lips parted in confusion. She flinched when he entered, pressing herself against the wall. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice thin and hoarse. Luke crouched down, his hands open, careful not to frighten her. "You're at Dawson Farms," he said quietly. "My name's Luke. You crashed last night, out in the sunflowers. You've got a bad cut, but you're safe for now." Ava blinked, trying to sit up. Pain flickered across her face. She studied him, searching for any sign of threat. "Is it safe here?" she asked, the words barely audible. Luke didn't know how to answer. Outside, the world pressed in a lifetime of debts, of being watched and judged, of always being the one on the bottom rung. Now, with this woman, the distance between their lives was a gulf he couldn't see across. Before he could speak, a new sound pricked the air footsteps on the porch, softer and quicker than Earl's had been. Luke's spine stiffened. He crept to the window, squinting through the curtain. Another figure, backlit by the brightening sky, hovered near the steps, face hidden beneath a hood, movements furtive. Luke raised his voice, steady but sharp. "Who's there?" he called, trying to sound braver than he felt. The figure paused, then turned and melted into the edge of the woods, the tension in the air thick as the rain that had only just begun to let up. He didn't move for a long moment, waiting to see if the shadow would return. Only then did he turn back to Ava, her eyes wide and frightened, as if she knew her troubles had only just begun. Morning in Selena arrived gentle and pale, with sunlight soft as cotton spilling across the kitchen floor. The storm had left everything smelling raw, wet earth, battered grass, the faint trace of ozone in the air. Luke Dawson moved quietly, careful not to wake the woman resting on his sofa. Her name was Ava. That much he knew now, and little else. He noticed, as he rolled back her sleeve to check the bandage, a jagged scar running down her left arm, a mark that looked old and deliberate, not the kind you'd earn in one night's disaster. Ava stirred, pulling her arm away with a wince, but her eyes softened when she realized it was just Luke. He offered her a small smile, awkward and tentative, then busied himself in the kitchen. He cracked eggs into a battered frying pan, the hiss of oil the only sound for a while. Outside, sunlight filtered through the sunflowers, making the farm seem almost peaceful, as if nothing strange had happened. But the tension in the room was real. Luke could feel it in the way Ava glanced around, noting every door and window, tracing the shape of the keys on the counter, watching the phone charger as if measuring her options. He set a plate before her scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and poured black coffee into an old mug. Ava thanked him in a voice barely above a whisper. She ate slowly, every movement precise. Her eyes never left him for long. Luke tried not to stare, but he couldn't help himself. In the daylight, she looked both vulnerable and dangerous, something wild behind her stillness. They talked about nothing at first: the weather, the coming harvest, news on the radio about the storm's path through Kansas. Luke told her about the hard years, the hailstorm that took his corn, the drought that followed. Ava listened, nodding, her face unreadable. When he asked about her work, she paused, fingers tightening on the fork. "I travel for business," she said simply, "mostly up in Chicago. I was just passing through." A moment later, a helicopter thudded overhead, distant, but loud enough to send a tremor through the glass. Ava stiffened, eyes darting to the window, shoulders tight. Luke watched her. She pressed a napkin to her lips, trying to look indifferent, but something about the sound unsettled her. She turned away, staring at the kitchen door as if expecting someone to come through it. Luke sensed the walls going up. He recognized the way she avoided his gaze, how her answers grew shorter. She started asking questions about the farm, how far it was to the highway, whether the neighbors kept watch, if the post office was still open in town. Her curiosity was sharp, almost professional, as though she were cataloging every detail. Luke played along, but suspicion gnawed at him. He'd grown up around people who ran from something: debt, bad decisions, small-town rumors. He recognized the instinct to hide. The silence between them lengthened. Luke cleared the plates and started washing up, hands moving in restless circles. He wanted to ask more about the plane, about the scar, about what she was running from, but the words stuck. He'd never been one to pry, but now he wished he could break through the wall. As Ava moved to stand, her sleeve fell back, revealing a gold watch glinting on her wrist. Luke's eyes caught the engraving on the band, A.S. It was heavy and elegant, the kind of jewelry you didn't see much in these parts. No one he knew wore anything like that, not out here where time was marked by the sun and the whistle of the grain train. Ava noticed his stare, tucking her hand out of sight. Luke wiped his hands on a towel, turning the moment over in his mind. The woman in his house was no ordinary traveler, no lost soul blown off course by the storm. There was a story here: money, power, maybe danger, stretching far beyond what Dawson Farms had ever seen. For the first time, Luke wondered if helping her had pulled him into something bigger than any storm. The sound of the helicopter faded, but the unease stayed. Ava retreated to the window, arms folded tight, watching the road as if she expected the world to come looking for her. Luke kept his distance, uncertain, both of her and of himself. The farm, so familiar all his life, felt different now, charged with secrets he hadn't chosen, waiting for a truth that wouldn't stay buried for long. The late afternoon brought a strange, metallic stillness to Dawson family farms. The storm had wrung every sound from the air, leaving the land quiet, the only movement a lone crow flitting above the windbreak. Ava sat on the edge of the sofa, ankle propped up, her eyes drawn to the window every few seconds. She'd spent most of the morning resting, but her restlessness only grew as the sun climbed higher, slipping through the patched curtains in thin gold lines. Luke kept busy in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, his mind racing in a circle of worry he couldn't shake. The sound of gravel crunching on the driveway sent a fresh tremor through the house. A black SUV, sleek and out of place among the rusted pickups and battered tractors, slowed to a stop near the front porch. Luke stiffened. He moved quickly, signaling for Ava to slip into the pantry. She hesitated, searching his face for assurance, then disappeared behind the old oak door. Luke wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door to the visitor. A tall man with silver hair and an immaculate gray suit stepped out, the sun glinting off his cufflinks. His presence filled the porch urban polish, pressing against rural simplicity. The man paused, his gaze drifting from the peeling paint to the muddy boots by the mat. He extended a card with gloved fingers. "Hayden, Sinclair Aerospace," he said, voice even and polite, yet carrying an undercurrent that made Luke's chest tighten. Hayden's eyes swept the yard, cataloging everything: Luke's threadbare jacket, the cracked step, the battered mailbox with the Dawson name barely visible. "We're looking into an incident involving one of our aircraft," Hayden continued, each word precise. "It was last tracked somewhere in this area. Did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" Luke met the man's gaze, jaw set. He felt the old shame bubble up of never quite measuring up, of always being the one under scrutiny. "There was a bad storm," Luke replied. "Heard a crash, but with the lightning, it was hard to tell. Figured it was just the wind tearing through the fields." Hayden offered a small, tight smile. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shoes barely disturbing the faded welcome mat. His eyes flickered over the kitchen, spotting the frayed towel on the oven, the jar of coins by the phone, the stack of overdue bills just visible on the counter. "Mind if I look around?" he asked. But it was clear this was not a request. Luke nodded stiffly. He tried to stand tall, but the lines of power were clear. Hayden moved with the assurance of someone who could buy and sell 1,000 Dawson farms before breakfast. He inspected the living room, gaze pausing on a thread pulled loose in the sofa, on the half-empty bottle of painkillers, on the faint outline of a woman's jacket draped over a chair. Hayden's glance was clinical, weighing and measuring. As he turned toward the hallway, Luke's pulse hammered. He thought of Ava, hidden just beyond the thin pantry wall. He tried to distract Hayden with talk of the harvest, but the man's attention never faltered. "We're grateful for any help." "Mr. Dawson," Hayden said, "the pilot is a valued member of our company. There may be a reward for information." Luke shook his head, saying he'd seen no one. Hayden's lips twitched, not quite believing. He wandered to the edge of the room and paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. Luke's heart skipped. There, barely visible against the wood, was a dark smear of dried blood from the night before. Hayden knelt, touching the stain with his handkerchief, rising to face Luke. "Anyone else here?" Hayden asked, his tone suddenly sharp, all the courtesy stripped away. The sunlight caught the steel in his eyes. Luke felt the air squeeze out of the room. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Just me," he answered, but the lie hung heavy in the air between them. Hayden studied him for a moment, the silence stretching, a judgment in every second. Then, without another word, he tucked away the handkerchief, leaving the door open as he stepped out. His footsteps faded on the gravel, but the threat lingered, more present than the storm ever was. Luke didn't move until the SUV disappeared beyond the bend. Only then did he let his shoulders fall, the weight of what he was protecting suddenly heavier. Ava emerged from the pantry, face pale, lips pressed tight. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The house stood silent, caught between what was said and what was left behind. Darkness settled hard over the flat lands outside Salina, the kind of night that pressed in around the old grain barn until only the sound of wind and shifting boards broke the quiet. The air was thick with a late chill, and inside, Luke Dawson and Ava Sinclair sat close, speaking in hushed voices beneath the single bulb swinging from the rafter. The barn smelled of old wheat, dust, and something older. Fear, maybe, or the feeling of being watched. Luke had moved Ava from the house before sunset. They crept through the side yard, heads low, wary of headlights sweeping the fields. He'd taken every back path, careful not to leave prints in the muddy earth. Now, hidden behind grain sacks and the shell of a rusted thresher, they faced the kind of silence that asks too many questions. Ava clutched her knee, face set but eyes wide with unease. "You saw him, Hayden," she whispered. "If Sinclair's legal team is sniffing around, it means my family knows I'm missing. They'll keep digging. They always do." She sounded younger when she was afraid. Luke rested his arms on his knees. "Why are you running?" he asked quietly. She looked away. "I can't go back. Not yet. Not after." Her voice trailed off, replaced by the scrape of wind through the wall. "If they find me, it's over. You don't know how it works in my world. It's all deals and secrets and people you can't trust." Luke watched her carefully. The lines in her face were clear under the dim bulb. She wasn't as fragile as she looked, but she was scared in a way he recognized. He knew about losing ground, about fighting for what little you could keep. There'd been years the bank almost took the farm, when rules always seemed to shift just out of reach. He reached for words, voice rough. "You want to stay here? I can hide you. But it won't be easy. This place, there's always someone passing through, always a neighbor poking around." Ava hesitated, lips pressed tight. "I'll pay you," she offered, but Luke shook his head. "It's not about money." A silence hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Ava's eyes flashed, defiant. "I'm not just a pilot, Luke. My work, it's mostly finance, asset management. I know the law, loopholes, taxes, all of it. I could help you with your land. There's programs you could use, debt consolidation, even legal fights against the bank. I can show you how to dig out." Luke's laugh was bitter. "People like me don't win those fights. Ava, not around here." She didn't flinch. "That's because nobody ever tried with the right information. Let me help. Let me do something useful, or else I'll lose my mind waiting." It was an offer he'd never expected a stranger. Battered and hunted, promising the one thing he'd wanted for years, a way out. He studied her, weighing trust against survival. He thought about his father's debts, about the hollow in his chest that had never quite filled since his mother's funeral. For once, he saw a chance that maybe, just maybe, the farm didn't have to be the end of the road. "All right," he said softly, nodding. "You help me. I'll keep you hidden as long as I can, but you have to follow my rules. No going outside in daylight. No calls, no emails, nothing." Ava nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing. She was still afraid, but there was something new in her eyes, a kind of hope she hadn't shown before. A sudden sound broke their fragile peace, a siren, low and mournful, drifting through the black. Luke's heart hammered. Blue lights flickered against the barn wall, casting nervous shadows. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Ava to stay quiet. The crunch of tires rolled down the lane, headlights slicing through the dark. Luke moved to the door, standing very still, feeling every beat of his heart in his throat. Ava crouched lower, clutching the ledger she'd brought, filled with notes and numbers that might just change his world. The police cruiser pulled up to the front gate, its engine idling. Luke watched through the crack in the wood, every muscle tight, out in the dark. Fate waited, as uncertain as the promise that now bound them together. Morning light poured thin and cold over Dawson family farms, the kind of light that left no corner untouched. The sky above Selena was pale and empty, the fields washed clean by the storm, but unsettled in ways the naked eye could not see. Luke stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, staring out at rows of sunflowers drooping under the weight of yesterday's rain. He barely heard the hum of an engine until a white Ford Explorer rolled down the drive, tires crunching on gravel. A flash of blue on the license plate Saline County Sheriff's Department. The car door opened, and Rachel Green stepped out, her brown hair pulled back, uniform crisp. She moved with a directness Luke recognized. He'd sat beside her in Mrs. Carter's history class at Salina High, back when life felt smaller, simpler. But time and the badge had changed Rachel. She belonged to the world of order and rules now, her gaze sharper, her stance wider, like she was always bracing against something invisible. "Luke Dawson," she said, crossing the porch in 2 strides. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about last night?" He nodded, bracing himself as she pulled out a notepad. Her presence filled the space, both familiar and foreign. She surveyed the front of the house, the battered mailbox, the old Ford tractor parked by the shed. "Sinclair Aerospace requested we do a walkthrough. They're not satisfied with what the corporate investigator found." Rachel looked him straight in the eye. "So, you want to tell me, in your own words, what happened out here during the storm?" Luke swallowed, the coffee suddenly bitter in his throat. He repeated his story: thunder, wind, a loud crash, nothing but flashes of lightning and the rattle of loose tin on the barn roof. His words felt rehearsed. Rachel's eyes never left his face. "You didn't see any vehicles on the road. No one on foot." She pressed, pen poised above the paper. "Nobody come knocking, needing help." He shook his head, feeling the pressure in his chest build. "Out in the barn." Ava sat pressed against the back wall, knees drawn up, holding her breath as every word reached her through the thin boards. She recognized the authority in Rachel's tone, a voice that left no room for mistakes. Ava had spent her life reading power, and she could feel it now, tightening like a net. Rachel glanced around the yard, then knelt by the muddy patch where the Sinclair SUV had parked the day before. She studied the ground, finger tracing a faint groove. "You've been out here since the storm, Luke. These look pretty fresh. Check the livestock early." "That's all," he said, hoping his voice didn't betray him. Rachel stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Anyone else on the property? Hired help? Maybe, or visitors?" Her questions came faster now, an edge in her voice. Luke hesitated. He could feel old trust from childhood clashing with the present threat of exposure. "No visitors. It's just me since Dad passed," he answered quietly. Rachel's expression softened, just a little. She looked past him to the farmhouse, the porch swing still, the door slightly ajar. "You all right, Luke?" "Really?" she asked, her tone briefly human. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She wandered further, following the tire tracks that curved around the barn. Suddenly, Rachel crouched again, examining a set of faint impressions in the mud. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. "These don't match your truck, do they?" she asked over her shoulder. Luke froze. Sweat prickled down his back. "No idea. I haven't had anyone here but the usual delivery van." Rachel didn't press the point, but she didn't look convinced either. She rose, closing her notepad with a snap. "If you remember anything, you call me directly. Don't talk to the Sinclair folks without me. Understand?" He nodded again. Rachel paused, one foot on the first step, her gaze holding his a moment longer. "Be careful, Luke. These corporate types, they don't play by the same rules we grew up with." She turned and strode back to her car. As the Explorer pulled away, Luke let his breath out slow, out in the barn. Ava released her grip on the old ledger, fingers trembling. They both knew the danger had just grown teeth. Rachel's car disappeared down the lane, but her questions lingered, filling the farm with a tension that would not be shaken easily. By midday, the air above the sunflowers was heavy, thick with rumor and the uneasy charge that follows a storm before the ground can dry. Word of the crash had traveled on every gravel road, in every diner booth and grain store up and down Salina. Dawson Family Farms, once invisible on the county map, was now the center of questions. Luke felt it in every cautious greeting, every neighbor's car that slowed as it passed the end of his drive. He knew what small towns did with secrets they picked at them, turned them over, and made them bigger than life. The afternoon faded into a long, uncertain dusk. In the kitchen, Luke and Ava moved quietly, their footsteps careful on worn linoleum. She stood at the window, watching light bleed out over the fields, her arms crossed as if bracing herself against something colder than the wind. Ava broke the silence first, voice low but steady. When I was a kid, the only time I saw my father smile was in the boardroom, she said, eyes fixed on nothing. Sinclair Tower in Chicago, top floor. I grew up in glass offices, not playgrounds. They gave me a gold pen before I ever touched a baseball. Luke rinsed a chipped plate, nodding. He knew enough to let her talk. My dad built this place after the war. We lost the East Field when the drought hit. He wouldn't take a loan, said a man should only owe what he can work off with his own hands. His fingers tightened around the edge of the sink. I thought I'd do better. But these days, sometimes I just feel invisible. Like nothing I do really matters. Ava turned from the window, stepping closer. The ache in her leg forced her to limp, but she hid it behind a steady posture. It matters, she said. Her words hung between them, as simple and solid as the kitchen table. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time. Why'd you run? Luke asked quietly. You don't seem the type to give up easy. She hesitated. Her voice dropped even lower. There's something wrong at Sinclair Aerospace. I saw the book's money missing, contracts forged. I tried to speak up, but my father's people shut every door. To them, I'm just the daughter, the pretty face for magazine covers. When I found out just how deep it went, Ava's jaw set, her hands curling into fists on the counter. I left. I thought if I could get away, maybe someone would finally listen. Maybe I could make it right. Luke let out a breath, slow and steady. And now she met his gaze, her eyes fierce but rimmed with worry. Now I'm just another problem for someone else to fix. But I can't go back, not until I know what to do. I thought money meant freedom. It doesn't. Luke shook his head. Freedom's not something you buy. Around here, you have to fight for it every day. They fell quiet, the sound of the wind against the screen door filling the room. For the first time, neither felt entirely alone in their struggle. Night came early. Luke booted up his old laptop, hoping for a distraction in the local news. As the screen flickered to life, a new email pinged. No subject, just a string of numbers in the address. He clicked it open. The message was short and chilling. Your guest is not who you think. Others know. Be careful. Luke stared at the screen, heart thudding. He shut the laptop slowly, his face drawn and pale. He didn't tell Ava right away. Instead, he turned out the kitchen light and stood by the window, watching headlights crawl down the distant road, uncertain who was coming for whom. The next morning, a restless hush hung over the farm. Luke stepped out onto the porch, boots heavy with last night's storm, and looked across the fields as if he might see his future in the neat lines of green. In his hand, the printout of the anonymous email felt heavier than it should have. He didn't need long to figure out the sender. Mark Samuels, the bank manager, had always been 2 steps ahead in every small-town game. Even before Dawson Family Farms began to slip from asset to liability on his ledgers, Mark had the patience of a man who'd never had to worry about missing a payment, and the quiet ruthlessness of someone who knew just how much power he held. Luke found Mark that afternoon, in the shade of the co-op's loading dock, eating a sandwich, his suit coat draped over one shoulder. You get my note, Mark said, not looking up. Small world, isn't it? Luke word travels, sometimes faster than crops grow. Luke tried to keep his face blank, not sure what you're talking about. Mark smirked, eyes sharp. A woman like that doesn't just show up around here by accident. You know, if you'd been honest about your situation, we could have worked something out. But secrets don't sit well with banks. They spoil, just like bad grain. Luke's hands curled into fists in his pockets. You want to call in my loans, go ahead. That's not what I'm offering. See, I know a thing or two about your guest. Maybe you want to keep that quiet for her sake. For yours. Mark leaned in, voice dropping. We could find a solution. You feed me what I need, a little information about your new friend, and maybe the farm gets an extension on those payments, maybe even some new terms. The old sense of being trapped came back hard. Every door in this town seemed to lead back to Mark, or men like him. Luke turned away, feeling the heat rise in his chest. "I'm not for sale," he said, not quite believing it himself. He told Ava everything that night. Her face was a mask of guilt and fear as she listened, hands twisting in her lap. "I can't let you get dragged down in this," she whispered. "You barely know me. Don't risk your life for a stranger." Luke shook his head. "You're not a stranger, not anymore. I've spent my whole life doing what I thought was safe, keeping my head down, not making trouble. But that's how people like Mark stay in charge. Someone's got to say no." The conversation carried on deep into the night. Luke, for the first time, let himself admit how desperate things really were. The bills, the bank notices, the creeping sense of failure. Ava listened, then slowly laid out an idea. You need out of their grip. If you move the farm towards certified organic, you can charge double, maybe triple. It takes investment, but it's not impossible. I know the paperwork, the marketing. We could make it happen together. It sounded impossible, but the way she explained it, step by step, something like hope began to flicker. The following day, the two of them started drawing up lists, researching what it would take to convert fields, who to call, what records to start keeping. Luke felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement, working with her. He noticed the way Ava's guard dropped when she talked about business, how she relaxed just enough to let a laugh slip through, how his own nerves settled when she focused on the plan instead of the past. But the world outside wasn't standing still. Mark was moving. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the water tower in town, Ava made her way to the corner store for groceries. She almost didn't notice Mark until he blocked her path, his smile tight and thin. "You think small towns keep secrets," he said quietly. "I know who you are, Ava Sinclair. You want that farm to survive. You'll cut me in. 15% on everything. Or tomorrow. Your face is all over the news, and the Dawson farm is history." Ava's hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "You'll get nothing if the farm fails. Mark, we're barely holding on." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Maybe you'll learn that in Salina. The only thing that matters is who's willing to play ball." She walked back to the truck without looking back, the groceries digging into her hands, her mind racing with the new threat. Luke was waiting on the porch, reading worry in her eyes before she even spoke. That night, as a restless wind battered the windows, the choices facing them both felt sharper than ever, and the future of Dawson Family Farms balanced on the thinnest thread of trust neither could afford to break. That afternoon, the Salina Community Center buzzed with restless energy. In the wide meeting hall, sunlight slanted through dusty windows, catching on rows of folding chairs filled with familiar faces hardened by too many seasons of drought and too few breaks from the bank. Luke stood at the front with Ava beside him, her hair tied back, eyes sharp and steady. She wore old jeans borrowed from the farmhouse, but there was nothing local about her confidence. Across from them, members of the Kansas Farmers Association watched, their arms crossed, eyes darting between the two like a jury waiting for a slip. Luke cleared his throat, voice rough but sure. He laid out their plan, how switching to certified organics, adding farm tours, and rethinking distribution could give Dawson Family Farms a shot at real survival. Every sentence. He felt the old shame threaten to drag him down, memories of past meetings where he'd been told, flat out, that the world had moved on without men like him. Ava took over, explaining the market, the paperwork, the numbers. She spoke carefully, her tone crisp, almost detached. There are grants, co-ops, new suppliers willing to take on smaller farms, if you can prove yield. You don't have to sell out, just build smarter. Her hands didn't tremble. She'd stood in front of bigger crowds, but never with this much at stake. The questions came fast and rough. Mr. Garrison from the Northfields wanted details. Where would the upfront money come from? Mrs. Price, who'd lost her land last year, eyed Ava and asked about her consulting background. "What brings you to Salina?" The word hung, dangling, an accusation more than a question. Others mumbled, "How do we know this isn't some city scheme to flip our land?" Luke stepped in. "She's with me," he said, quieter, but it cut through the noise. "You all know my family's worked this soil for 3 generations. I wouldn't risk that on a stranger." The room calmed, but the suspicion didn't fade. As the discussion dragged, it was clear people smelled something off. Then Carl Winters, the bank's local rep, gray suit, pale face, never a smile, stood up in the back. "All this talk of change is fine, but there's due diligence to be done. New partners, new money, the bank will want full transparency. I'm sure you understand. Luke, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Luke felt his stomach twist. The warning was as much for Ava as it was for him. Carl came close after the meeting, his hand on Luke's shoulder. "You cooperate, everything stays friendly. You don't, well, audits can get ugly, especially with new faces around." Luke nodded, words caught in his throat. Outside, he found Ava by the truck, the light catching her features, making her look at once strong and impossibly vulnerable. She stared straight ahead, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. As Luke opened the door, she glanced up and handed him her phone. On the screen, a message from a number she didn't know. The text was short, chilling in its simplicity. "We know who you are, and nothing is safe now." Ava's voice was barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about the farm anymore. Someone wants to make sure I don't get a second chance." Luke looked out at the empty parking lot, the sun sinking behind the silos, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. He wondered if hope could survive the next blow, or if trust would break before dawn. The storm had come again, but this time it wasn't rain or wind battering the farm. It was a tempest of rumors, legal probes, and unseen eyes. Dawn broke over Dawson family farms, the usual calm shattered by the arrival of an audit team. Men and women in crisp suits moved through the property with clipboards and scanners, their steps purposeful and eyes sharp, sweeping over every ledger, every contract, every small detail of transactions past and present. They spoke in clipped tones, interrogating Luke and Ava, sifting through records like miners searching for veins of gold or fault. Mark was there too, a constant shadow. His presence was like a cold wind cutting through the heat of the day. He smiled often, but the smile never reached his eyes. He played his role well, pressing Luke with veiled threats and promises. "It's simple," Mark said quietly during a break in the questions. "You hand over the land rights to the investment group. That stops the audits, keeps the rumors from spiraling, keeps the bank happy. Everyone walks away without trouble." Luke felt the weight of every word settle on his shoulders. It was the same script he'd heard countless times: give up, fold, let go of what little he had left. He glanced at Ava. She sat on the edge of the porch, her hands clenched tight, jaw set. She had insisted they fight in her own way, using the financial know-how she brought. But now the odds felt suffocating. The neighbors whispered from a distance. News traveled fast in small towns like Salina, and the story had taken on a life of its own. Some believed Luke was hiding something bigger than a stranger in his barn. Others whispered about the mysterious woman, a city heiress, dragging the farm into chaos. Amid the growing tension, Ava felt the sharp pang of guilt more than anyone. She could see how much Luke was struggling, the way his eyes darkened with worry after every conversation. She knew the stakes were higher than just land or money. This was about survival, his and hers. Late one night, Luke sat by the old kitchen window, staring out into the shadows cast by the silo. The wind whispered through the cornfields, carrying secrets he wasn't ready to hear. That's when the unexpected happened. Rachel Green, the local detective who had once questioned him so coldly, stepped quietly onto the porch. Her eyes were steady, but her voice was low and urgent. "Luke," she said, "I've been watching, listening. Things are worse than they seem. Sinclair Aerospace and their allies aren't just auditing, they're trying to squeeze you out for good. You're not alone in this." Luke blinked, the weight of suspicion shifting, just for a moment, into something like hope. Rachel handed him a small envelope, saying, "This might help." but you need to be careful. They're watching everyone connected to you." Before he could ask more, she slipped away into the night, leaving Luke with the envelope and a racing heart. Later that night, as Luke moved quietly toward the barn, he noticed something out of place, a faint impression on the ground near the window of the grain storage. A set of footprints, too large to be his or Ava's, marked the soft earth. Someone had been there, silent and deliberate. The chilling thought settled deep in his gut. They were no longer just fighting financial ruin. They were fighting shadows in the dark. He bent down to trace the outline of the footprints with his fingers, cold sweat prickling his skin. Outside, the wind carried a whisper, a warning that the battle had only just begun. The community hall in Salina was packed to the brim that Saturday afternoon. It was the kind of gathering where neighbors exchanged wary glances and hushed whispers, the kind of room where trust was a rare commodity. Luke stood off to the side, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn coat, watching the crowd as Ava stepped forward. Her presence was a stark contrast to the dusty earth and faded farm buildings, her posture firm, her eyes steady. A woman standing in defiance against the storm that had been gathering for months. The murmurs grew louder as she cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice calm but edged with something fierce and resolute. The questions came fast, sharp, and probing about who she was, what her intentions were, and why she had appeared in this small farming town, so far from the high-rises and polished boardrooms she came from. Some in the crowd were skeptical, even hostile. They whispered about city slickers and outsiders meddling in their lives, about a woman with secrets and perhaps an agenda. Ava did not flinch. Instead, she told her story not with the arrogance of a corporate heir, but with the weariness of someone who had fought hard and lost more than most could imagine. She spoke of her escape from Sinclair Aerospace, the scandal that had erupted in the boardroom she once frequented, the corruption she had uncovered, and the personal cost of standing up to powerful interests. She explained how she saw the Dawson family farm not just as a piece of land, but as a chance for redemption, a place where hope could be cultivated alongside crops. Luke felt a swell of pride and something unfamiliar, a budding trust, as he listened to her. This was not the Ava he had first met, the frightened woman hiding in the grain silo. This was someone who had fought her own battles and come out bruised but unbroken. The crowd's mood shifted in subtle ways. Some faces softened, while others hardened. Doubt still lingered. But for a few moments, Ava's courage seemed to bridge the divide between them, a divide built on years of suspicion, inequality, and fear. Then came the interruption. Carl Winters, the bank representative who had been quietly observing, stepped forward with a grim expression. His voice cut through the room like a cold wind. "If any violations are found in the farm's accounts or land deeds," he warned, "the bank will have no choice but to seize assets. This community will suffer consequences it cannot afford." A hush fell over the gathering, the weight of his words sinking in. It was a reminder of the fragile balance that held everything together, the threat of losing it all at any moment. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. Rachel Green, the local detective who had walked a difficult path from suspicion to tentative ally, took the floor. She held up a stack of papers, sealed in a clear plastic folder, confidential documents she had obtained through quiet investigation. "These," she said, "prove the financial misconduct Ava spoke of. Sinclair Aerospace has been hiding illegal transactions, manipulating the system to its advantage." The room reacted as if struck. Some gasped. Others whispered in disbelief, but no one could deny the evidence laid bare before them. The veil of secrecy was torn away, leaving the community with no choice but to confront the truths they had long ignored. Luke's eyes met Ava's across the hall. In her gaze, he saw the mingling of shock and fragile hope. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the path ahead was clear, a path that required unity, courage, and the willingness to fight not just for survival, but for justice. The old divides seemed a little less insurmountable, the distance between their worlds a little less vast. The night had settled heavy and still over Dawson Farm, but inside the old barn, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ava sat on a wooden crate beneath the flickering glow of a single bare bulb, her hands clenched loosely in her lap, eyes tracing the shadowed corners of the space. Outside, the fields stretched wide and dark, the night alive with the quiet hum of insects and the occasional distant call of a night bird. But here, the silence was more like a presence, an unwelcome weight pressing down on everyone. Luke paced restlessly just beyond the barn door, glancing repeatedly at the latch as if willing it to hold. He was no stranger to hard nights, to worrying about what tomorrow might bring. But this felt different. He felt the weight of something bigger closing in. The truth had spilled out to the town, the fragile peace shattered. Now, the consequences were no longer just whispers or rumors. They were knocking hard, ready to break down the doors. Then the sound of heavy tires crunching on gravel shattered the quiet. The black SUV rolled slowly down the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. From the vehicle emerged three figures: Mr. Hayden, the cold legal counsel of Sinclair Aerospace, flanked by two stern-faced men carrying briefcases and official papers. Their arrival was like a storm entering the calm, a reminder that power and money were not forces to be underestimated. Hayden's voice was smooth but steely as he laid out the harsh reality. The company had initiated formal legal proceedings. Ava and Luke were warned to cease all harboring and interference, or face immediate court action. The papers in his hands detailed the beginning of a legal siege that threatened to swallow the farm and everyone on it. Ava's eyes hardened. Years of boardroom battles and cutthroat deals flashed through her mind. She recognized the language of power, the threat behind the polite phrases. But here, in this barn filled with hay and dust, it was different. This was real life. This was personal. Luke stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. Despite the tremor in his voice, there was a fire in his gaze. He spoke with quiet authority, telling them no one would step onto his land without his permission, no matter the law or the threats. This farm was his home, and he would protect it with every fiber of his being. Ava watched him, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of strength that neither had fully seen before. Luke's resolve gave her courage, but it also deepened her fears. How long could they hold out against forces so vast, unseen in the shadows? Rachel Green recorded every word, her voice low and steady, her hands steady on the small device tucked in her pocket. The weight of her decision hung in the air. Sending this confrontation to the local press could change everything. What was once a quiet struggle would become a public fight, stirring emotions across the state, forcing Sinclair Aerospace into the harsh light of scrutiny. As the SUV's engine rumbled back to life, it cast long shadows across the barn's weathered walls. The vehicles pulled away, tires spinning in the gravel, fading into the night. But their warning lingered. Tomorrow would bring the courthouse, the law's heavy hand knocking louder than ever. Luke closed the barn door behind him and stood in the dark, the barn light flickering above like a heartbeat. The fight was no longer just for survival. It was for justice, for dignity, for something much deeper. Morning rose, sharp over Dawson family farms, but the warmth didn't come. It was the kind of Kansas dawn that felt watched. Luke stood at the edge of the gravel drive, his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes squinting at the dust clouds crawling in from the road, one by one. They came state police cruisers, two black SUVs with tinted windows, a bank van with a clipboarded agent, and a satellite truck with a news logo slapped across its side. The gravel crackled louder than usual. Rachel Green stepped out first, her badge already visible and voice crisp. She motioned for the perimeter to be kept clear. Behind her, a man in a gray suit and polished loafers adjusted his tie like he was stepping into a courtroom, not a field. Sinclair Aerospace's legal team had arrived. Luke's boots felt heavier with each step toward the porch. Ava joined him halfway, her hair tied back tight, eyes clearer than they'd been in days, but her fingers trembled against the clipboard she carried. "They're going to tear us apart," she whispered, "only if we let them." Luke answered. His voice was steady, but inside, he was bracing for the impact. At the barnyard clearing, A makeshift podium was set. Cameras flicked open. A Sinclair representative, tall and neatly rehearsed, addressed the crowd. "We are here in accordance with the Kansas Business Integrity Act to investigate potential misconduct regarding land holdings, illegal concealment of identity, and breach of financial contracts." The crowd stirred. Neighbors, drawn by the noise and flashing lights, lined the fence posts. Some whispered, some watched, like they'd already made up their minds. Ava stepped forward. "I'll speak." Luke turned to her, unsure. "I have to," she said. The microphone crackled. "My name is Ava Sinclair." "Yes, that's Sinclair. I was born into the company now threatening this land. But I'm here today not as a representative of wealth, but as someone who walked away from it." Gasps, murmurs. A few phones came up. She continued, "I found fraud inside Sinclair Aerospace, unauthorized asset transfers, land appropriations under shell names. When I tried to report it, I was silenced and hunted. Dawson Farms gave me shelter when I had none. And now I stand here with a proposal, not a defense." A bank agent cut in, voice cold. "This land carries debt. Your presence here violates the legal disclosures required for contract renewal." Luke stepped forward. "Then let me show you something." He pulled a battered folder from the inside of his coat and spread its contents on a makeshift table, a full breakdown of his and Ava's revised farming plan, new distribution channels for organic goods, letters of interest from a Kansas City grocer, a small loan application now backed by a local co-op. "This is our future," he said, "and it doesn't belong to Sinclair, or any boardroom 1,000 miles from the soil." Stillness. Then came the counterattack. "We have every right," said the Sinclair lawyer, "to investigate, to seize, to ensure no fraud infects our economy." That's when the young man in the back spoke up. A journalist, barely 30, corduroy jacket, glasses slipping down his nose. "Actually," he said, raising a USB drive, "I think the fraud's already there." He handed it to Rachel. Inside are emails, transaction logs, and land acquisition memos proving that Sinclair Aerospace has been orchestrating unlawful land takeovers across Kansas under the guise of third-party investment arms. And this farm is next in line. The crowd erupted, some gasping, others shouting. Reporters began calling out questions. The Sinclair team stiffened. Ava clutched the podium, eyes locked on the field beyond. Luke didn't move. He just stared at the banker who once denied his loan and saw the man swallow hard. The wind picked up, scattering hay across the yard. Rachel turned to her officers. "Nobody leaves until we go through this." And for the first time, the power shifted. And in that flicker of silence, Luke realized they weren't defending anymore. They were being heard. The day Kansas stopped to watch wasn't a Sunday or a holiday. It was a Tuesday morning in early fall, the kind where cornfields turned gold and the air carried a stillness before harvest. But in Salina, that stillness broke. Trucks lined up outside the community center. Journalists spilled out with tripods and mics. People came in denim jackets, business suits, old farm caps, and college sweatshirts. Some came to support. Some came to judge. All came to see Ava Sinclair stand up against her own name, inside. The fluorescent lights hummed over rows of folding chairs. The old wood-paneled walls of the center, usually used for bake sales and school recitals, now bore witness to something heavier. Luke sat in the front row, shoulders tense, jaw tight. His flannel shirt still smelled faintly of soil. He didn't speak. He just kept his eyes on Ava. She stood at the podium, no makeup, hair tied back, a single page of notes in her hand. But she didn't read them. "My name is Ava Sinclair," she began, her voice low, steady. "And I am not here to defend who I was. I'm here to take responsibility for what I've seen." Murmurs rose and fell like wind in wheat. She spoke of years in boardrooms, of silent signatures and overlooked questions. She told them how internal audits were buried, how numbers were changed, how communities like theirs were deemed expendable. She didn't shield her father or brother. She didn't shield herself. She admitted she'd run because speaking up from inside would have meant nothing. It had to be from here, from the ground they were trying to erase. People shifted in their seats. A few stood in the back, arms crossed, suspicious, but most listened, drawn in not by drama, but by a quiet kind of courage. Then Rachel walked forward, holding a USB drive. "I believe the community has the right to know the rest." The screen lit up. Audio crackled. It was the recording from that midnight confrontation in the barn. The threats, the legal intimidation, Mr. Hayden's voice, sharper than glass if she speaks. "We bury them both." No one moved. Ava didn't flinch. She watched herself being cornered in her own fear and watched that fear break. Then something shifted. Mr. Hayden stood, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Then he stepped toward the microphone. "I was supposed to make sure this went away quietly," he said, voice rough. 30 years ago, I signed a contract that gave them more than just my name. It gave them my silence. I regret that. I regret every day I let this system chew people like you apart." Gasps followed. A woman in the back dropped her purse. A man with his arms crossed slowly lowered them. "I can't undo that," Hayden added, "but I can help make sure it doesn't happen again." He turned to Ava. "If you'll have me, I'll testify. I'll help investigate. This has to end." And then applause. Not a roar, not a standing ovation, but a slow, rising sound. Like seeds finding soil, like breath returning to a room that had held too much. Ava didn't cry. She just let the weight go. Her shoulders dropped. She stepped down and walked toward Luke. For the first time since this began, she looked like someone choosing to stay, not because she had nowhere to go, but because this was where truth finally rooted. Luke opened his arms, just a little. Ava leaned in, quietly, resting her head against his shoulder. Around them, cameras flashed. The state police moved in, collecting evidence. Reporters huddled around Rachel and Hayden. But for that one moment, in the center of it all, they were just two people who had chosen each other over fear. And still, no one quite knew what the morning would bring. Weeks passed quietly after the storm had cleared, not the weather, but the legal chaos that had swallowed Dawson family farms. Each morning now, the dew glistened on rows of lettuce and heirloom carrots, and the sound of distant tractors blended with birdsong. The air smelled of turned soil and something newer like promise. The first harvest of their organic crops went smoother than anyone dared hope. Trucks lined the path near the barn, taking fresh produce to markets and regional co-ops across Kansas. Labels now bore the Dawson name, alongside a modest emblem that read, "Soil to Soul." Luke stood beside the last shipment of the week, sleeves rolled up, hands dusty. He watched it pull away like a father watches his kid head off to college, wary, proud, quiet. Ava had settled into a rhythm not built on headlines or balance sheets. She'd taken a role at the vocational agricultural school in town, teaching students about sustainable farm practices and business integrity. Her lectures weren't polished or rehearsed. They came out like field notes, real, a little weathered, but rooted in experience. The students, most of them with dirt beneath their fingernails and stories in their eyes, listened like they knew she'd lived it. Luke and Ava had begun building something together that didn't have a contract or a ledger, just early mornings, late dinners, and shared looks across long rows of corn. They learned when to talk and when silence was enough. Neither of them used words like healing or destiny, but the truth lived in the way he brought her coffee without asking, or how she always left the porch light on, even if he said he'd be home before dark. In town, the aftermath of the Sinclair fallout still lingered. Investigations unfolded slowly. Files were unsealed, but the focus had shifted. People now spoke of Rachel with respect, of Hayden with a hesitant kind of forgiveness. He had partnered with her to start a fund for independent farmers, those too small to fight back, too honest to cut corners. They called it the Dawson Trust. It wasn't flashy, but it made headlines for the right reasons. The day of the wedding came on a gentle Saturday, when the wind barely moved and the clouds stayed high and thin. They didn't rent a hall or order swans or hire a band, just chairs on a field of sunflowers. rows of neighbors in clean jeans and open collars, and a local bluegrass duo playing slow. Luke wore his father's old jacket, Ava, a pale linen dress with her mother's necklace tucked beneath the collar. Rachel officiated, her voice steadier than anyone expected. When they exchanged vows, no one looked at their watches. There was no bouquet toss, just a silence after they kissed like the land itself, paused to hold the moment. And when they walked back down that aisle between rows of worn boots and tearful smiles, the town stood and clapped not for a victory, but for something harder and rarer understanding. Later, at twilight, Ava stepped away from the voices and music, walking down a narrow path between blooming crops. Her hands brushed the tops of leaves like they were pages of a story only she could read. She paused at the edge of the field, where the sun had just begun to lower itself into the dirt. Luke watched from a distance, not calling her name. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had settled. Something had finally come home. The sun slipped low behind the rows of sunflowers, casting long shadows that didn't feel so heavy anymore. No one spoke of what was lost, or what nearly was. They just passed plates, laughed too loud, let the breeze carry whatever pain was left. Maybe the real change didn't come with the verdicts or the headlines. Maybe it came when someone dared to stay, even after the storm passed, when hands found work again, when hearts let go of what should have been. And as the light settled quiet across the fields, you could almost hear it ask, what would the world look like if we all chose to begin again, right where we are?